So I'm here to talk about a project that we call Legend of Evelys. And it's really a case study into how we can do inclusive game design. First of all, I'd like to start with the fact I'm not an inclusivity expert. I'm not a UX designer. I'm a researcher in digital health. So I work at the, does this work? No, it's backwards. I work at the National Research Council of Canada, which is this big building on the side of the 20 in Boucherville you probably have passed by. So it's the largest research institution in Canada. We're larger than any other academic institution. And we study a bunch of things, including life sciences and the lab I'm a part of, which is the Simulation and Digital Health Lab. And my research interest is looking at how we can use gaming technology and VR to help with health, mostly cognitive health and mental health. And in the context of that work, I've worked on a project called Legend of Evelys. Legend of Evelys is a project that came out of the pandemic because one of the reasons why the government of Canada has scientists on its payroll paid by your taxes is so that when a crisis happens, you can have a bunch of scientists who start working on that problem. Scientists who are not torn between academic duties or duties to companies, people who are really working for the sake of the country. And we were trying to see how we could play a role in the management of the pandemic and the mental health crisis that would inevitably follow the sanitary crisis. And we thought, what if we were to design a role-playing game to teach psychoeducation techniques for anxiety management based on cognitive behavioral therapy? Because we know that there are well-known ways of managing anxiety, and there are classes and courses available to learn those techniques, relaxation techniques and cognitive restructuring techniques, but a lot of people just don't go through them. They will register but stop after the first chapter, or they're just not interested. So if we were to gamify this in the form of a role-playing game, maybe we could reach more people, or reach people who wouldn't be reached by the more traditional means. So like I said, I am a researcher. I'm not an inclusivity expert. I am a white, hetero, able-bodied woman, so I can certainly not speak on behalf of marginalized populations. And I'm not somebody who does inclusivity solely as my work. But the good news is, and if there's one thing you take from my talk, is this, it's that you don't need to be an inclusivity expert to put inclusivity at the core of your design. It's not something that should be left to experts, and especially not left to marginalized people. It's something that we should all care about and all include in the work that we do, regardless of what's our role in tech. So, before we follow defining what is all of that, I'd like to do a little exercise in empathy. Ask you to think of when you were othered. A moment where you were in a situation where you didn't fit, or where the world around you was not designed for you. For me, that's easy. I just had to remember back to when I was in school and the captains of the basketball team would pick up teams, and I knew that I would be the last pick. I was a small girl with glasses and absolutely no talent at basketball. And that feeling of shame and knowing that I was in front of a task that was set up for me to fail and fail publicly, that was terrible. And I don't mean to say that this is equivalent to what marginalized people live in terms of micro and macro aggressions on a daily basis. But that feeling of shame and that feeling of that the world was set up against me was totally unfair, I can use that as fuel to understand what others people live. So you don't need to be in a disabled body to imagine what it's like to use tech that is designed only for able-bodied people, Or you don't need to be a Black person to be scandalized by the fact that there's no Black people in most of the mainstream media, or not in a way that is representative of our population. So that empathy that you feel, you can use it to ask questions, learn, and decide to just do better in terms of inclusivity. So what do I mean by inclusivity? And what comes to mind is diversity and representativity. When I asked my 10-year-old, what do you think I'm going to talk about today? She said, ben, vas-tu dire qu'il n'y a pas de filles dans les jeux, puis quand il y en a, sont à moitié tout nus? So yes, that's part of it. So having a diverse cast in terms of age, origins, gender, all those things. And also letting your players see themselves in the game if they have their own avatar. But it goes beyond that. There's also accessibility to users of varying ability. A large part of the population is living with a disability, and we often don't think about those people when we design software, and games in particular. There's also languages and literacy. If you cannot read the text that's in the game, you're a big part of the game. And that's a big barrier to the use of technology. And finally, there's the economic and technological inclusivity. Not everybody has the latest iPhone. So if you're designing for a system that will only work for people who are rich enough to have the latest technology, or who have an excellent cell phone connection all the time, you're going to lose a lot of people. Convince you if the empathy angle was not enough. Here's for the rationals in the room. 22% of Canadians live with a disability. Like, that is not marginal. That's a huge part of the population. It's 16% in the world, but our population is older than average, so it's a little bit more. 42% of baby boomers are gamers. So those are people who are starting to have issues with eyesight, with hearing, who are a huge part of our market. There's a lot of baby boomers out there, and they play game a lot. They have time and they have disposable money, and yet the gaming market totally forgets about these people and doesn't design for them. 15% of the world is neurodiverse, so that's either ADHD, autism spectrum, or another form of neurodiversity. And yet, these people are never part of our design inputs. 48% of Canadians don't have literacy skills sufficient to understand a complex text and make inferences. That's the level at which the OECD assumes that we need to have to function in the modern world. 48% of Canadians don't meet that criteria. And 4% are not even reading at the level of a 6 or 7-year-old. That's a lot of people who are being left outside of the tech conversation, and we're not able to use today's tools and today's games. Another interesting number that you can get from Android themselves, 10% of Android users use older operating systems, so older phones. And to give you an example, the VaxiCode app that was supposed to be usable by anybody, I mean, it's something that you needed to show in your daily life, 6% of Canadians didn't have an operating system that could run that application. And that's scandalous. Like, the government made an app that was supposed to be usable by everybody, and they didn't think of that 6% of the population doesn't have the means of having a recent cell phone. Cell phone that is recent, but with old hardware in it. And another interesting thing, if you look on most language tech, there is not a single First Nations language. Like, you can learn Klingon on Duolingo, but you cannot learn Innu or Mohawk. which means there's a lot of people living here in Canada who are, I mean, they probably speak French or English, but their native language is not handled by any language tech, ever. They don't get games translated for them. They're completely left out of the conversation. So what I wanted to show you today is how we approach the problem of inclusivity in our game. Now, I work for the government of Canada, so of course we had a mandate to make this game accessible to all Canadians, and especially to be able to reach people who might have been left out of other systems to support their mental health. So inclusivity was really at the core of our values right from the start of the project. Legend of Evelys, like I said, it's a vintage style role-playing game with really like monsters and treasure chests and quests. It's really an RPG. But throughout that game, we're going to be teaching all kinds of skills related to mental health and cognitive restructuring skills. So being able to identify cognitive biases and learning about the tools you can use to manage your anxiety. And it went pretty deep in terms of theoretical content. Like it's not superficial. We went really deep into teaching cognitive behavioral therapy, but through a very lighthearted medium. Oops. I need to be here. No. So it contains a bunch of things. There are stories of people struggling with anxiety. So as you meet the characters, you'll see those stories evolving. It's very storyline based. There are tools for what we call behavior activation, meaning taking the skills that you learn in the game and applying them in real life. There are exercises for cognitive restructuring or learning to identify biases in your own thoughts and rewriting them. And there are mindfulness journaling tools. I no longer have a clicker. So what did we do in terms of accessibility? Those here are kind of the basics. Like the first things that you don't need really any training to think about. Having customizable font sizes and zoom so that people with less than perfect eyesight can customize the game for their needs. We implemented 3 navigation modes so that you could have a virtual joystick, you could use point and click, or you can use waypoint-based navigation so that our system would be usable by people using screen readers like blind users. We made our buttons large enough with enough space in between them so that if you had motor skills issues, you could still click on the buttons easily. And we used a plugin. We use Unity. So we use a plugin called the Unity Accessibility plugin. That's pretty much the standard for screen readers. So it's something that you can add on to your game and make it compatible with existing OS-based accessibility tools like screen readers and letting people activate buttons by voice, without the use of their eyes. And we also provided all text in audio form so that people with literacy issues or eyesight issues could still function in the game. So those are kind of the basics. Like that's what we thought about when we said, okay, how can we make this accessible? But we tried to go beyond that. The first thing, and that's the thing I would suggest you do, is we tried eating our own dog food. So we tried the game without our glasses on or with a blindfold. We tried the game with a stylus like this one. We bought a bunch of styluses that people with motor disabilities will use. Like some can be held in the mouth, some can be attached to your hand. And we tried, how is our game like if we have those physical limitations? And you don't need to be disabled to see that it's sometimes very frustrating to use a stylus like that if the button is too small or if the interface is not designed properly. Another thing we found, and this is not something we found necessarily, we asked also specialists, is that you're better off doing customization options that are on sliders rather than just a disability mode that's on and off. First of all, it's a lot less stigmatizing. You can choose to prefer bigger fonts, even if you're not disabled. And it can also be customized to the level of your disability or just the level of your preference. And the last thing we try to do is really thinking about how can we go beyond just accessibility and figure out how would this make it fun for somebody with a disability? How can we make this a fun game if we take out the graphics? Is there still enough meat to our game so that there's still something to it? And asking that question made us really rethink things like our soundscape. Like, can we improve the music? Can we improve the sound effects? Because if we remove the visual side, that's all that's left. So really going beyond, like, can we check the box of accessibility, and can we really make this a pleasant experience? Now for diversity, again, we went with what made sense to start with, so multiple skin tones. We implemented, of course, gender choice, including non-binary. We opted so that clothing options would not be gender divided, like if you choose to have a man, you can still pick up a skirt in the clothing. There's no option there. We implemented cultural hairstyles, like the possibility of having a headscarf or a turban, so that people could see themselves in the game as an option. And we tried to have a diverse cast in the game. So the characters that live in the world are diverse in terms of family structure, in terms of age, in terms of gender, in terms of color. We tried to have them represent the reality of Canada, which is diverse. But we also tried to, again, push it a little bit further. So one thing we did is to make sure that the initial character was random. It wouldn't be a white guy by default. So when you start the game, perhaps you're going to have somebody with pink hair, a skirt, and a beard. And if you're not happy with that, you just change the default. But at least everybody gets to change the default. We also tried to have representativity of people who are disabled in the game. And that was a little bit more complex because we had to think of changing our walk cycle so it would support a wheelchair and a cane. But that's something that people really noticed. And I've had people tell me, this is the first time there was someone like me in a computer game. And very few commercial games do that. In terms of language and literacy, well, we decided to have translation right from the start of the game, not wait until the end to think about translation. Figuring out grammar in French for non-binary characters was a little bit of a struggle. And that's a nice example of where we had to really dig and make a decision. Because at that time, the government of Canada had not any guidelines around inclusive writing. They just said, try to avoid it, which is nice if you're writing a memo, but if you're writing an RPG game, there's a lot of verbs you have to avoid if you don't want to have anything that gets conjugated to the feminine or masculine in French. So we looked at different options, and we went with the median point option. So if your character is non-binary, you get the median point. But if you're female, you get the female version, and if you're male, you get the male version. So if you're offended by inclusive writing, just turn it off. We also decided to make support for low technological capacity one of our core values. So right from the start, we decided that we would be supporting cell phones and mobile devices who were 8 years old. So we said that in Unity, like this is going to be our minimum Android version, and we're not touching that. And if there's a feature that is getting blocked, we're going to work around it. But if you get away with the default, probably a very high version, and you try retroactively to lower it, it's going to be really complex because you've already explored all the modern features, game engine, and getting back to a lower version is a lot more work than thinking about it right from the start. And we also tried to limit cell phone usage. We thought that not everybody has data readily available or at a reasonable cost. Especially for northern communities, access to internet is a struggle. Generally, internet is extremely expensive in the northern communities. And for a lot of people, the only place they're going to have Wi-Fi is at the community center or at the library. So we made sure that our game could work offline, gather all the information when you had Wi-Fi signal, when you didn't have Wi-Fi signal, and send it in bulk when you were connected. So all those were like little things that didn't take a lot of effort, but continuously through the development process, we always ask ourselves, is this inclusive? Going back to the 4 categories, and are we leaving somebody out? Who's missing on this? Who won't be able to use it? And in this case, I was doing a project for the public funded by the government of Canada. So it made sense to go all the way towards inclusivity. And we probably didn't make a perfect solution. There are probably still a lot of things we could be doing to do it better. But of course, it might not make sense for any game developer to do all of this. Like, if I'm doing a virtual reality system, of course it's not going to be available for blind people. Like, the platform itself is designed to tap into eyesight. But if I'm asking myself those questions and I'm putting it in the design right from the start, at least it's a deliberate choice, and I can justify that choice. Why did I choose a platform that blind people could not use? It's a decision that I have to justify, think about, and can answer to. Whereas if I just go with the default and just don't ask myself those questions, then I'm going to end up with the statu quo, which is going to be, like my daughter said, games with no women, where the women are all half naked. If you just don't ask yourself and you stay with the statu quo, you're leaving a huge part of the market and a huge part of the population. So a few take-home messages. The first is that if you do decide to be inclusive, throughout the project, you're going to ask yourself, who am I going to be offending? And this is going to be scary. Like, you know that some people are going to call you woke, for sure. And some people are going to be very vocal about it. And sometimes it's very tempting to just do nothing because you don't want to offend anybody. But we have to keep in mind that doing nothing is also offensive. So it's also always a question of asking yourself in good faith, what is the decision that I can live with myself? What is the decision that my team can live with and that we could justify if people were asking questions? If you're trying to please everybody or to please the majority, chances are you're just going to stay with this statu quo. The other take-home message is that inclusivity needs to be part of the development process right from the start and continuously through the development process. If you wait until the end to figure out accessibility, to be able to check a box, maybe you're going to be able to check that box, but it certainly won't be good and certainly won't be pleasing for people who need those features. For a character cast, like if you just add a female character at the end just so that it looks inclusive, probably that character is not going to be as well-rounded, as well-integrated in the storyline. People will know, will catch the bullshit. So it's really something you need to think about right from the start. And it's not going to be free. Chances are it's going to take more time and more effort to do things inclusively. So you really need to think of this as tapping into a huge market that you're ignoring. If you're only designing for young, white, rich males, that's a very narrow slice of the pie. And there's this whole market that you're ignoring. So it makes sense to invest in inclusivity. The other thing is that inclusivity the right way, it's going to make things better for everyone, not just the people who need the game. It's going to make your characters more well-rounded, more interesting. It's going to make your game more usable. Like I said, the example of the soundscape, yes, it made things better for blind users, but it also made for a more interesting game for everybody. when we added navigation modes, it made navigation better for a lot of people. A lot of people chose to use the mode for blind users because they just preferred it. And we didn't realize that until we did it. And finally, and if you only remember this, I'll be happy, is that it's not just the business of expert. Everyone can decide to be inclusive. It's not rocket science. You just need to ask yourself questions, ask people around you, do usability testing, but it's something we can all do. We're all capable of empathy. We're all capable of finding that fuel within ourselves to think of others and just be decent human beings. So I hope that you're not going to be fearful about this, and you're not going to be fearful about offending people, and you're going to decide from now on that it's going to be part of your design. So thank you, everyone, and I hope I'm going to have a few questions.